Hey everybody, Sayre at Nova Motorcycles. This week we have a bike that's near and dear to my heart. It is a 1981 MotoMorini 3.5. If you follow us, you know that I race a 1979 MotoMorini 500, and I just think they are some of the coolest bikes ever made. They're weird, they're quirky, they're odd. That's sort of redundant, but that really describes them. This bike came out in 1971, was the first year. And if you know the history of stuff or you follow us along, you'll know that in 71 there was a lot going on in the motorcycle world. Brits were struggling, Japanese were dominating, and superbikes were really taking over. And those are 750cc and up, very fast machines. What did MotoMorini do? They came out with a 350. Not only did they come out with a 350, they came out with a brand new air-cooled pushrod 350 at a time where the industry was going towards overhead cams and water cooling and much more high-tech things. But what has been said about this bike in the time, in the press of the time, and everybody who's ever ridden one ever since, is never has a bike been so much more than the sum of its parts. Just meaning if you look at it on paper, it's not impressive. Pushrod motor, air-cooled, really basic frame, which is a cradle frame, off-the-shelf Italian suspension and brake parts, which are good, but not anything to write home about necessarily. But it was designed and put together so well that it handles like nothing else. This little power unit puts out a ton of power for what it is, and it's really just a gem. So a couple things about it. The V angle on the motor is 72.5 degrees, not 72, not 73. 72.5. The reason they did that is they wanted to get as close to a 90-degree V angle as possible, because with a 90-degree, much like a Ducati or a Moto Guzzi, you have a perfect primary balance, which means the pistons are counterbalancing each other very well. Vibrations are cut down, power and torque is increased. It's nice. They wanted to do that, but they didn't want to make the bike as long as the Ducati was. The early 70s Ducatis were incredibly long and hard to turn. So they wanted to keep a narrow wheelbase, and so they compromised, and they said, this is as tight as we can make it and still have a very good primary balance. The cylinder head of these things is what's called a heron head, which means that the head itself is perfectly flat, and the piston is dished, rather than the opposite, which typically the piston has a dome on it, and the head is a hemispherical or somewhat concave shape. This was opposite. What you can do with that is you get parallel valves, perfectly up and down, which means that instead of the normal shape of valves going like this at each other, they're like this, and that creates an incredible swirl effect. So when the charge comes in, the fuel and air comes in, it really roils up and really gets emulsified and burns incredibly well. So this little thing gets about 75 miles per gallon, as well as making, I want to say, the horsepower out of this version, which is the Strada version, makes about 35, 36 horsepower. Which compared to say like a Honda 350 of the same genre, was a Honda 350 was about 32 horsepower. So even though it's a pushrod motor versus an overhead cam motor, it actually made more power and was more efficient than the Honda 350. The other cool thing that sets it apart from the Honda is it's got a 6-speed gearbox, not a 5-speed gearbox. It was very much meant for people who want to ride quickly. Even though this is the street version, the sport version came later. The Strada came out in 73. The Sport came out in Strada came out in 71. Sport came out in 73, I believe. The Sport had a hotter cam, a little bit higher compression, clip-on bars out of the factory, and was just a raging little cafe racer, basically. Even though that was the sport bike, the Stradas are also meant for people who want to, tuck it in on a good back road. And really just don't slow down for those corners. Keep it in the power band and keep going. As I said before, the brakes and wheels and suspension, Grimeca, Marzocchi, off-the-shelf Italian stuff. It's not Brembo, it's not Ceriani, but it's pretty darn good, and it works really well. This being the 81 has a nice brake caliper on it, disc brake in the front, drum in the rear. My Strada race bike, my 500, has triple disc, 2 discs in the front, 1 in the rear. But when they came out in 71, there was drums all around, very much of the time. Although even like the pushrod motor, a little bit outdated for 1971 when the industry was moving towards discs. Cast wheels, these were some of the first early use of cast wheels on production bikes. I mean, not in 81, but in the mid 70s when they started using these. These look like tubeless rims, but they're not. They do not have a ridge for them. So while you could technically fit a tubeless tire on it, you have to put an inner tube in it when you run it. A little weird thing of the time period before they fully made it into the whole tubeless cast wheel world. Other than that, a really famous thing about these things is it's called a 3.5, not a 350, 3.5. Watching this in classic bike magazines, and when I was my young days at Team Obsolete, I would see this and it caught my eye. And the MotoMorini was the first bike I ever saw in a magazine first and sought out and decided I needed to get, and ended up finding one. And it was a 3.5 that did it. Even though I ended up with a 500, that little 3.5 was like, that must be the coolest bike in the world if that's their design choices. Other weird things, much like other Italian bikes, left side kickstart really takes a while to get it, but not too bad once you figure it out. These things are pretty much, if you keep them in good tune, they're pretty easy to start, so it's not too big of a deal. But again, something that's quirky and weird and not normal if you're used to it's a traditional American style bike. Yeah, that's about it for what it is. If you've ever ridden one of these, please chime in, tell us how much you love it. I personally, as an owner of one, know that anybody who rides one and loves one is somebody that I probably have a lot in common with as far as riding styles, because they're just made to be fun. As I said at the beginning, they don't look that great on paper. It doesn't matter. Much like my Buell, another bike I love, doesn't look great on paper, but when you're out on the actual road, it is one of the most fun machines you can be on. And that's what it's all about. So if you have any experience with them, let us know. If you have other bikes you think are suitable competition for one, absolutely let us know. Let's have that talk. I love that. And as usual, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.